We learned yesterday that when the Mishnah says that when the ERU is above and you are below, it's not a good ERU, because the ERU is in a Rishus HaYachid because it's resting on a tree, on a part of the tree that's above 10 tefachim high, and you, in your mind, you're not there physically, but you want your domain to be at the base of the tree, which is a Rishus HaRabim. Since the domain that you designate and the food are in two different domains, and therefore you cannot transfer from one place to the other, that's not a valid Kniya Shvisa. You're not Kniya Shvisa that way, and therefore you have not created an Erev Tchumen. The Gemara had challenged that. The Gemara had said, but wait a minute. We know that when a person stands even in a Rishus HaRabim, wherever he's standing, there's an immediate radius of 4 amos that he acquires that becomes a pseudo Rishus HaYachid. Now that doesn't mean that you can actually transfer from a Rishus HaYachid to where you're standing. No, you're still, for purposes of Hotza'ah, you're still considered to be in a Rishus HaRabim. But for the purposes of being Koine Shvisa, where the food is in one place and you're in this sort of your own space of this 4 amma radius, it should at least help for the purposes to allow the food to be considered to be accessible to you, to ameliorate this rabbinic law of tchumen. That was the Gemara's question. So even if the food is higher than 10 tefachim and you want it to be Koine Shvis at the base of the tree, it's a Rishus HaYachid and a pseudo Rishus HaYachid, and therefore it should work. The Gemara's conclusion was, you're right, it does work. You know what we're talking about? Where not only is the food resting above you, but it's also resting on a branch that's horizontally protruding outwards from the tree, which is farther out than your radius of 4 amos. So therefore, it's outside of your purview of your pseudo Rishus HaYachid, and the only way, therefore, to get the food to where you want it to be would be have to transfer it from that Rishus HaYachid via a Rishus HaRabim to where you want to be Koine Shvisa. That we can't allow, and therefore it's not going to work. So that was where we left off tomorrow. So the Gemara now asks a question, Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. Umay Lamaila, Uma Lamata. So the Gemara's question is, now based upon the way you're explaining it now, it turns out that the food is not directly above you, it's really off to the side above you. So therefore the words Lamaila and Lamata are misleading, because Lamaila seems to imply that it's right above you, and Lamata means it's right below you. Like Rashi explains, it should have said Begova, it should have said Gavoa V'namoch, it should have said that it's high and low, not above and below, because above and below relates to a vertical spatial relationship, and that's not true over here. So the Gemara says no, Dahadar Zakif. The answer is that we're dealing with a tree where the branch looks like this. Now, just imagine that my body is the trunk of the tree. This part of my arm is the branch that goes outwards 4 amos, and then it shoots up like this. So when it says Lamailo Lamata, it means as follows. This part of the branch that extends out horizontally is below 10 tefachim. And then it shoots up like that, and the food is right here. The food is resting on a knob, let's say right over here. And so when it says Lamailo Lamata, it really means that Lamata is the part over here that is within the same domain as I am in Rishus HaRabim, and the food is above, and therefore it's not going to work. That's the way the Gemara says you have to explain. V'ha'i boi maisi la derech alav. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, if that's the case, why can't you say that you could access the food from the place where it's resting up here to the domain at the base of the tree where you want it where you want to be, by saying that you don't have to go through a Rishus HaRabim in order to get it to where you want it to be. The food's up here. You could actually pass it over until you get to where right above where you are, and then drop it that way. In other words, pass it along the top of the branch over here until it gets up here, and then you can drop it downwards, so you'll never have gone via the Rishus HaRabim, which is below 10 tefachim. So just pass the food, like, just imagine a guy climbing up the tree and walking along this branch, and then just passing the food straight downwards, and therefore you won't have to go via Rishus HaRabim, and so therefore you could be Koine Shvisa. So the Gemara answers Kisharabim Mekastim Olav. The answer is, says the Gemara, we're talking about a case where people are using this part of the branch, my bicep, right, this part of the branch, they're using it regularly to place their items on it. So it is a publicly used branch which is an active use. And as a result, Uchid Ula, like Ula had taught, the Amar Ula, Amud Tisha Birishus Harabim Verabim Mekastim Alav V'Zark V'Nachal Gabav Chayav. Ula said that when you have a pillar that's in Rishus Harabim, that's 9 Tvachim high, less than 9 Tvachim, it's considered to be not a Rishus Harabim because it's considered to be too low for people to use for practical utility. Higher than 10 Tvachim, it's a Rishus Hayachid. So between 9 and 10 Tvachim is considered to be a usable space for the masses if people regularly put things on it. So therefore, if I throw a red rubber ball from Rishus Hayachid and it lands on that pillar in Rishus Harabim, I've done a malacha because that's a Rishus Harabim. So basically what the Gemara is saying is that even if you could imagine a guy climbing up the tree and picking off the food and walking along the top of the branch or just passing it along over this branch, you're still going via a Rishus Harabim. And like Rashi explains, we've learned before that if you have two windows that are either next to each other or across from each other in a Rishus Harabim, and you throw something from one window to the other, so then the halacha is your putter, because if as long as the windows are higher than 10 tfachim, it's not going to be a problem. But if you were to pass something from one Rishus Hayachid to another Rishus Hayachid via a Rishus Harabim, and you pass it in such a way where you're holding it above 10 tfachim, you're still going to be chayiv. And the reason is we learn that from the Levium, we learn that from the way that malacha was done in the Mishkan, that the bottom line is that passing something over a Rishus Harabim from one Rishus Hayachid to another is still considered to be a malacha. And therefore, since this branch is actively being utilized as a Rishus Harabim, even if you were to pass the food over the branch, you'd be passing it over a Rishus Harabim to get from the Rishus Hayachid where it's currently residing to this guy's domain at the base of the tree, and therefore there would still be a malacha involved, and therefore there's no way to get it from here to there, and therefore the guy can't be Kona Shvis, it's not a kosher or eruv. We're going to go weiter. The Gemara's question now is, if this is confusing to you, then you're normal. My Rebbe umay Rabbana. The Gemara's question now is, what is this machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, and the Chachamim? Now, what did we see yesterday? We saw yesterday that according to Rebbe, even if the food is on a tree, it's still going to be a kosher eruv as long as the place on the tree where it's resting is lower than 10 tfachim. Why is that? It's because you and the food are in the same domain. But you have another problem. What about the fact that you're mishtamesh be'ilan, that you're using a tree? The rabbi said you're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos as a utility space. And therefore anything that's resting on a tree is not accessible to you. So how do you get around that problem? Because you can't get it off the tree to bring it to yourself. Answers Rebbe, when are you Kona Shvisa? At what point on Shabbos do you need to acquire domain by having the food? Bein Hashmashos. And Bein Hashmashos, the rabbis did not, there's no rabbinic prohibitions extant Bein Hashmashos. So therefore, if in theory Bein Hashmashos you wanted to pull the food off the tree, that would be permitted. It's only afterwards on Shabbos that the rabbi's prohibition sets in, and therefore you can be Kona Shvisa. So now the Gemara says like this: where's this machlokus Rebbe and the Chachamim, where the Chachamim say that the rabbinic prohibition is extant even Bein Hashmashos? So it's like this: the Tanya Nasno be'ilan l'mayla me'asar tvachim ein eruva eruv. The Brisa says as follows. It's a little bit of a strange Brisa, but we'll see. We'll try to get through it. The first part of the Brisa says, just like our Mishnah had said, that if you place the food on a place on the tree that's above 10 tfachim, then the eruv is not a valid eruv. Again, because we said that you want to be kind of shvisa at the base of the tree. Lamata me'asar tfachim eruvo eruv. But if you place the food on a place on top of a place that's lower than 10 tfachim on the tree, then it is a valid eruv because now you and the food are in the same place. The Asr Litlo. But nevertheless, if you come on Shabbos, let's say you come the next day to where your Erev is, you will not be allowed to pull it off the tree because you're not allowed to be Mishtamish Be'ilan. So that's perfectly consistent with Rebbe Shita. B'soch Shlosha, Mutar Litlo. If, however, if the Erev is within 3 Tvachim off the ground, so then you are allowed to take the Erev. The reason is because anything that's within 3 Tvachim off the ground is not considered to be a Mishtamesh Be'ilan. When the object is within 3 Tvachim from off the ground, it's considered to be mamish on the ground, and therefore you're not utilizing the tree. And therefore it's perfectly fine to take the food. Next, so we've seen 3 cases so far. One when it's above 10 Tvachim, one when it's below 10 Tvachim but above 3 Tvachim, and the third case is when it's below 3 Tvachim. Next case, Nasnu B'Kalkala. What would happen if you'd put the food in a basket, Utala'o Be'ilan, and then you hang it on a branch on the tree? So then, afilu l'mala me'asar tfachim eruv divrei Rebbe. So then, even if the basket is higher than 10 tfachim on the tree, it's a valid eruv. Now that doesn't seem to make any sense. I can understand if you wanted to argue that the fact that it's in a basket and not directly resting on the tree makes it that you're no longer mishtamesh be'ilan, you're not using the tree directly. So that's one thing. But still, it's got to be within the same domain as where you want to be kona shvisa. So why is it that the Brisa says that if it's higher than 10 tfachim, it's still a valid eruv? It shouldn't. V'chachamim omrim, so we'll analyze that. V'chachamim omrim kol makom she'asr litlo ein eruvo eruv. And the chachamim come along and they disagree. And they say that any place where if right now you can't take the food because of some prohibition, so then it's not a valid eruv. Now, that's the end of the Brisa. So the Gemara's question now is, v'chachamim omrim ahaya. On what part of Rebbe's previous statements are the Chachamim coming to disagree? Ilema aseifa, if you're going to tell me that they're arguing with the Seifa, that Rebbe says that when the food is in a basket and the basket is hanging on the tree, that's what we call tzedadim. That's what we call utilizing the side of the tree or utilizing the tree indirectly. And Rebbe says that that's okay. And the Chachamim and you're telling me the Chachamim are coming along to say that even utilizing the side of the tree is prohibited, so lema kasavri rabbanan stadim asurim. Then that would imply that the Chachamim hold that you're not allowed to use the side of the tree or have an indirect utility of the tree. And the Gemara says that's problematic because in Masechet Shabbos, where this is initially discussed, this was debated among the Amoraim, and no one brought the Chachamim as a support to their position. So Ella Aresha. So rather you have to say that the Chachamim are coming to argue with Rabbi Yehuda Anasi on the first part, which was the case where the food is resting directly on the tree. And there Rebbe had said that even though right now you can't access the food, since Bein Hashmashos the food was permitted to access, therefore the Erev is a good Erev. And the Chachamim say no, that just like it was forbidden to access it now, it's forbidden to access it Bein Hashmashos, and therefore it's not a valid Erev. So now the Gemara says, okay, fine. Now we've got clarification on this machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim as far as rabbinic prohibitions either applying or not applying Bein Hashmashos. But now let's go to the second case of the Mishnah, of the Brisa rather. The second case of the Brisa had said that if it's in a basket and the basket is resting on a part of the tree that's higher than 10 tfachim, so then it's a valid Eruv. So the Gemara says, Hai Elon Heichidami. That explain this tree to me. Idales be'arba'a makom peturhu. If the tree is less than 4 by 4 tfachim in its girth and its width, so then even if it's higher than 10 tfachim, it should never be a problem because that's called a makom petur. A makom petur is like a post that's narrower than 4 by 4 tfachim. So then even if it's higher than 10 tfachim, you're allowed to transfer from Rishus Harabim or Rishus HaYachid onto it from back to those domains. So therefore, why would there be a problem either in the Reisha or the Seifa if the food is resting on a pillar that's higher than 10 tfachim but has less than 4 by 4 tfachim girth? So therefore, there shouldn't be a problem either in the Reisha or the Seifa. V'idi ispe arba'a kinasanu bekalkala my havi. And if you're going to tell me the tree that we're dealing with is 4 by 4 tfachim, in which case, if it's higher than 10 tfachim, so then it's a rishus hayachid. So what difference should it make whether you put it in a basket or not? It should not help to be an eruv because it's in a different rishus from where you want to be kona shvisa. That's the Gemara's question. Amar Ravina Reisha de Isbe Arba'a, Seifa de Lesbe Arba'a. So Ravina comes up with a very creative answer. He says we're talking about two different trees. The tree in the first part of the brisa was talking about a tree that's actually a rishus hayachid, that it's 4 by 4 in girth and it's 10 tfachim high. Okay, 4 by 4 in girth, 10 tfachim high. So when it's resting on top of that knob on the tree, it's resting in a rishus hayachid, and that's why the Reisha says that it's not a valid eruv because the food is in rishus hayachid, and you want to be kona shvisa in rishus harabim, so it's not going to work. The Seifa, which says that if it's in a basket above the 10 tfachim mark, it is a valid eruv, is where we're talking about a tree whose girth is less than 4 by 4 tfachim, and in that situation, therefore, it is considered to be a makom petur, in which case you can transfer from the top of that tree down to where you want to be, which is in the rishus harabim. Now, why then are we talking about a case of a basket? Because the kalkala mashlimasa le'arba'a. So you got to really pay attention if you want to understand this. The kalkala mashlimasa le'arba'a means as follows. The food is in a basket. Now, the basket is a receptacle that is less than 4 by 4 tfachim. And as we're going to discover, according to this brisa, you need, once the eruv is above 10 tfachim, you need it to be resting on a platform or in a container that is at least 4 by 4 tfachim. Even if the way that it is elevated is less than 4 by 4 tfachim, but the actual place where it's resting on the top has to be a 4 by 4 tfachim platform. And the basket, therefore, even though it's less than 4 by 4 tfachim in its receptacle space, mashlimaso le'arba'a, you have the basket attached to the side of the top of the stump, the tree stump or the tree branch, which is where the food is resting, remember, is less than 4 by 4 tfachim. The basket is less than 4 by 4 tfachim, but because the basket is adjacent to the top of the tree, it's not resting mamish on top of the tree, it's resting over here. It's somehow with a sling or a rope, it's tied to the top, the side of the top of the tree, and when you take into account the receptacle space of the basket and supplement that with the width of the tree, then you get a full 4 by 4 tfachim space. Now, even though the part of the tree is solid mass, and you can't count that as receptacle space, we're going to say that you can imagine it as if that part of the tree is hollowed out so that it could supplement the basket receptacle space to imagine the basket as being a 4 by 4 tfachim basket. And therefore you have to say that Rebbe Savar Rebbe Meir v'Savar Rebbe Yehuda. He holds like these two Tanoim, both Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehuda. Savar Rebbe Meir, the Omar Chokikin lahashlim, v'Savar Rebbe Yehuda, the Omar ba'idon eruv al gabi makom arba'a v'leka. So he holds like Rebbe Meir, who says that you're allowed to use that imaginary chokikin. We had this case when we talked about a doorway, which is in the shape of an arch. Remember, we said that in order for a doorway to be a halachic doorway to be chayiv in the mitzvah of mezuzah, it has to be at least 10 tfachim high and 4 tfachim wide, both from the base and on the top. It's got to be squared off. 4 tfachim wide, 10 tfachim high. What if you have an archway? If you have an archway, so it starts off at the bottom as being 4 tfachim wide, but then it tapers inwards. Rabbi Meir had said, no, chokikin lahashlim. You imagine that you cut out a squared off part in order to be able to make this door going all the way up to 10 tfachim high, and even at that point it's 4 tfachim wide as well. So Rabbi Meir has the concept of chokikin lahashlim. You create an imaginary boring through in order to supplement the requisite measurement. Here too, you imagine the top of the tree stump as being hollow in order to supplement the requisite 4 tfachim by 4 tfachim receptacle space that you need in order for the eruv to be resting. Why? Because we hold like Rebbe Yehuda, who says that in order for an Eruv that's higher than 10 Tfachim to be Kona Shvisa, to acquire domain, it has to be resting on a Makom Chashuv, it has to be resting on a significant platform. Because since it's elevated off the ground, it's like in midair. So it's got to be resting on something that is wide enough to be considered to be a chashuv of place. And a chashuv of place is 4 by 4 tfachim. And if you don't have that, that's why the case of the brisa was you're a narrow tree stump, and that's why it's in a basket, so the thickness of the tree stump will augment the deficient size of the basket. My Rebbe Yehuda, what's this Rebbe Yehuda? The Tanya Rebbe Yehuda Omer, Na'atz Korah B'Rishus Harabim V'Heinirach Iruvo Aleha, that this case is of Rebbe Yehuda, we see is in this brisa. A guy takes a stick, he sticks it down vertically into the ground, in a Rishus Harabim, and he places his Eruv on top of it. So Gavoa Yuda Rechav Adalet Eruvo Eruv. If the stick is like a pillar, it's 4 by 4 tfachim wide and 10 tfachim high, and he puts the food on top of it, then it's a valid Eruv, which in itself seems to be contradictory to what we've been learning all along. Because since you want to be Kona Shvisa on the base, and it's a Rishus Harabim, how's it going to work? V'im lav, but if it's not if it's lower than 10 tfachim, or not 4 by 4, ein eruvo eruv, it's not going to be a valid eruv. So adarabba, so the Gemara says, if anything, it should be just the opposite. Hu ve'eruvo b'makam echad. If it's lower than 10 tfachim, then it should be a valid eruv, because then they're both in Rishus Harabim. So elahachi kamer. So rather you explain it like this: Gavoa asara, if the pillar is 10 tfachim high, tzarach sheyehi barosha arba'a. Then you need for the top platform to be 4 by 4, even though the stick is less than 4 by 4 tfachim wide. That's what the brisa means. Ein gavoa asara, but if the stick is not 10 tfachim high, ein tzarach sheyeh barosha arba, then you don't need the platform on top to be 4 by 4 tfachim, because once it's lower than 10 tfachim, it's considered to be close enough to the ground to be resting on a makom chashuv, an important place, even without the platform or the receptacle that it's resting upon to be 4 by 4 tfachim. But the bottom line is you see that's Rebbe Yehuda's shita, that when the Eruv is above, the food is placed above 10 tfachim, the platform that it's resting on, or the receptacle that it's resting on, has to be a 4 by 4 area. Now the Gemara says, Kiman, who does this go according to? Delo ka Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda. This idea that when you have a stick that is narrower than 4 by 4 tfachim, and there's a platform above it that's 4 by 4, then it's considered to be resting on a makom petur, and therefore it's accessible to the people on the bottom of the stick. That must not go according to Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda. The Tanya Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda Omer, Noach kana b'Rishus Harabim v'hiniach b'rosho traskal v'zark v'nachal gabav chayav. Because Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda is of the opinion that if you have a stick, a very narrow stick, and you have a basket that's resting on top of it, which means the stick is like a spear, and you just take the basket and go, and then it's sticking through from the bottom of the basket. If I throw my red rubber ball from the Rishus Harabim and it lands in the basket, so then I'm chayiv because I've transferred from a Rishus Harabim to a Rishus Hayachid. Now, according to what we've just explained, that should not be a Rishus Hayachid, that should be a Makom Petur, because the stick is narrower than 4 by 4 Tvachim. And yet you see that Rebbe Yossi Rebbe Yehuda holds, by virtue of the fact that the basket on top is 4 by 4 tfachim, that makes it into the whole thing into a Rishus Hayachid. So the Gemara says, no, you don't understand. Afilu tema Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda, hasam hadron mechitzta, hachalo hadron mechitzta. The answer is based on another Talmudic principle which we've learned before, which is called good achis mechitzta, which means that when you have walls that are above, you can imagine those walls coming all the way down to the ground. Now here the basket is 4 by 4 tfachim wide as a receptacle with walls. And basically, in that scenario, since the basket is directly on top of the stick, then you imagine the walls of the basket coming all the way down to create imaginary walls down to the ground of 4 by 4 tfachim, which means that you have a full-blown pillar from an imaginary perspective that creates a Rishus Hayachid. Over here in our scenario, that's not the case. You've got a narrow stick with the basket slung onto its side, the side of the top, in which case you can't say good achis mechitzta, because you don't have the walls coming around all sides to encompass the stick. And therefore, even Rebbe Yossi b'Rebbe Yehuda would agree that in this scenario, it's not a Rishus Hayachid, but rather a Makom Petur, and therefore the Eruv is a kosher Eruv. Now, that concludes that. So Rabbi Yirmiyah Omar, Rabbi Yirmiyah now says, I have a different explanation to this whole brisa. Up until now, we've heard Ravina's explanation. Ravina said, the only way that you can reconcile this brisa is that the first case, which said that if it's higher than 10 tfachim, it's not a kosher eruv, is because what? Is because the tree stump is wider than 4 by 4 tfachim. So anything on top of it that's higher than 10 tfachim is a rishus hayachid. But when the Seifa says that if it's in a basket higher than 10 tfachim, it's a kosher eruv, is because we're talking about a tree stump that's narrower than 4 by 4 tfachim, and therefore it's a makom petur. Comes along Rabbi Yirmiyah and says, I disagree. Amar shayni kalkola hoel v'yachol lenatosa ulahavia l'sol chasara. So he says no. Both the Reisha and the Seifa of the Brisa are talking about the same tree stump. In both cases, it's 4 by 4 tfachim. And in both cases, the top of the tree stump is a rishus hayachid because it's higher than 10 tfachim. Why then in the Reisha is it not a valid eruv, and in the Seifa it is a valid eruv? Because of the basket. Why? Because when you have something in a basket, then you don't have to lift the basket off the area where it's resting in order to access its contents. You can just turn it on its side, tilt it, keep tilting, until the basket turns on the side while it's still touching the surface that it's resting upon, and it lowers itself a little bit lower at the top, which is now toward the bottom of the basket. It lowers itself below the 10 tfachim mark, and the contents can easily spill out. So therefore, since in theory you could tilt the basket and still have it being on the place where it's resting all along, and the food falling out and coming to where you want to be, which is at the base of the tree, lower than 10 tfachim, so then it's called a valid eruv, which is basically a very creative answer, but it's suggesting that since you can imagine the basket being tilted, even though the basket currently is residing in a place which is a rishus hayachid, but since it can be tilted to lower it below the 10 tfachim mark, no more rishus hayachid, but now rishus harabim, so then it's considered to be accessible to you, and it's a valid eruv, and that explains why the Seifa says that it's a valid eruv even if the basket is higher than 10 tfachim. So Yosef Rav Papa v'ka'amar lahashmaita. So Rav Papa is repeating over this teaching, and Eisvei Rav Bar Shava, Rav Papa, so Rav Bar Shava hears this and he says, I don't understand. Let me show you a brisa that demonstrates that you can't imagine something being transferred. Until it's actually transferred to the place, it's not a valid eruv, right? And I'll show this to you from the brisa. Keitzad hu oseh, molicho barishon u'machshav alav v'notlo, ubalo b'sheni machshav alav v'ochlo ubalo. So the brisa over there is talking about a case where Yontif is on a Friday and followed by Shabbos. And here you have a guy who wants to, both on Yontif and on Shabbos, to be able to have an eruv tchumen, to be able to walk beyond the city limits. Okay? So the thing he does is that he's got this loaf of bread or whatever food he has. So Thursday evening, right, which is eruv Yontif, he goes ahead and puts the food where he wants it to be, beyond the city limits, to create the eruv tchumen. The next, after he waits for it to be there during the Bein Hashmashos period, he's allowed to retrieve the food and bring it home with him, because on Yontif you're allowed to carry. And the reason why he wants to retrieve it is he's worried that if he leaves it there longer, someone's going to come along, an animal's going to come along and take it and eat it. But he wants to use that food again for Friday afternoon to make another eruv tchumen for Shabbos. So then he can take it, and then he can come back the following day on Friday afternoon and put it back and create another eruv tchumen. So amai nema kaven di boy amtuye motzi mamtile afagol the lo amtuye kamanda amtuye dami. So the Gemara says, why is it necessary for a person to actually have to travel on an eruv Shabbos or an eruv Yontif in order to put the food down? If you're saying that conceptually, even if the food is not in the place where you want it to be, but it could be put there, that like by tilting the basket, that's enough to make it to be considered in the place where it needs to be, then why don't you just say, forget about my making an eruv tchumen in the place where I want to be kind of shvisa. I'll leave the food at home, and I'll imagine that it's been brought over there. I'll just imagine that my food was taken from my refrigerator and put outside the city limits. If you can imagine the food spilling out of the basket even before it has, then why can't you imagine the food that's resting in your refrigerator at home being placed in the place where you want to be Kona Shvisa? It's the same principle conceptually. So the Gemara concludes, Amar Reb Zera, no. Reb Zera says it's different in a situation where you want to be Kona Shvisa and you have to get the food over to the place where you want to be Kona Shvisa. Why? He says, Gzeira mishum yomtiv shechalios acher Shabbos. He says that's a special case because the rabbi said that you actually have to have the food there. Because if you don't have the food there, we're worried in a situation where Sunday is Yontif. When Sunday is Yontif and you want to be Kona Shvisa on Saturday afternoon to enable you to travel beyond the Erev on Sunday, then you have a problem because you can't imagine the food getting from your refrigerator to the place where you want to be Kona Shvisa because you can't carry because it's Shabbos. So the rabbis made a straight across the board policy is that even though imagination helps, but it doesn't help when you want to transport the food from one place to a completely place from your house to the place where you want to be Kona Shvisa because of a situation where you may want to be Kona Shvisa on a Shabbos itself. Okay, that explains everything. Have a wonderful day.